On August 8th, 2018, a new Super Smash Bros. Ultimate Direct opened with the reveal of Simon and Richter Belmont as playable fighters. Not only that, but Dracula would be a boss, the new Dracula's Castle stage would feature classic monsters from the original game, and Alucard would be an assist trophy. To say I was excited at the prospect is a bit of an understatement. There was just something immediately cool about seeing this gothic action game in Smash, and while I had always enjoyed the series, specifically the Metroidvania titles, there were some major gaps. Specifically, I had never beaten or even played the original Castlevania. And so, 4 days later on August 12th, I decided to stream that game. It was an incredible experience despite it taking half the stream for me to just beat Dracula, and convinced me that I should stream the other major Castlevania titles as well. But while I was playing Castlevania 2, I was asked a simple question by my good friend, some call me Johnny. Would I play Haunted Castle, the Castlevania arcade game that was notoriously hard? I had never even heard of it, but I decided to take the challenge anyway. And in doing so, I decided that I would go beyond playing every major release. I would play every game in the Castlevania series released in the United States, 32 games in total. And now, after a year and a half, I have done it. It's an incredible feeling and a hallmark of just how good the Castlevania franchise is as a whole. Not once did I feel burned out or get tired of playing them. Seeing what each new entry offered was a highlight, and showcasing the series to other people who had never played them was a joy. But now that it's over, it's only appropriate that I should rank them. Which ones were my favorites? Which ones surprised me? Which ones were overly hated? Well, let's find out as I list each Castlevania game from my least favorite to my most beloved. And in this video, we're covering 32 to 11. I hate Castlevania the Adventure. It is by far the most miserable time I had playing the series, and I was only able to beat it in the first place thanks to the 3DS Virtual Console's save states. And I tried to avoid them. I really did. But it just became too much for me at a certain point. The adventure focuses on Christopher Belmont, who sets out to defeat Dracula 100 years after Trevor of Castlevania 3 fame, and 100 years before Simon. This is early Castlevania, so the story is nothing more than a Belmont setting out to defeat Dracula. The fact is, the game was one of the earliest released on the Game Boy, and it shows. Christopher is agonizingly slow, and the Game Boy's limitations means that he doesn't have any sub-weapons. Instead, his whip can be upgraded twice. The first makes it longer and more powerful, while the second allows him to shoot a fireball with each strike. It's a cool idea. Shame you'll barely see it after the first of 4 levels. Every time you get hit, it gets downgraded, and enemies are everywhere. I played through most of the game with the basic version, which just makes the whole thing even harder. And the level design is brutal, especially the notorious third level, which consists of dodging instant death spikes from above, then climbing ropes as spikes rise from below, before heading back to the left while spikes come in from the right. Combine this with Christopher's slow speed, few checkpoints, and having to restart the entire level if you lose all your lives, and I was livid by the end. The Dracula fight is crushing as well, with a specific pattern that must be learned and 2 forms that make it all the worse. Play a little out of curiosity, but don't torture yourself with this one. In a twisted way, it's fitting that I played the 2 worst Castlevania games on the same night. But of the 2, Haunted Castle is much more tolerable, if only because of the modern conveniences included with its re-releases. Otherwise, this might be the worst. It's a retelling of the original Castlevania, except this time Simon has to rescue his wife from Dracula. There's nothing much to say, except I find it utterly hilarious that Simon goes from a tuxedo on his wedding day to his barbarian attire when going after Dracula. Haunted Castle strays from the hallmarks we now know as standard Castlevania by including unique sub-weapons such as the boomerang, and Simon's weapon becoming a sword as he upgrades it. The game looks good for the time, though Simon's walk animation is a far cry from his beloved strut. He just looks awkward. But the most baffling decision came from the continue system. Rather than being unlimited, or at least unlimited until you ran out of quarters, players only get so many continues. Once they're gone, it's back to the very beginning. Players could insert coins to restore their health, but this would use up your limited continues. It is a bafflingly stupid system for an arcade game, and likely why it failed. Thankfully, modern ports get around this issue because otherwise, the game would be nearly unbeatable. There's so much coming at you at all times. Heck, I hit a literal brick wall that would kill me over and over again in the first level. It's not a great game, but the soundtrack is fantastic, with many of its unique songs getting remixed in later games. It also has one of the silliest Dracula fights in the series that can be hilariously cheesed with the stopwatch. Haunted Castle is an oddity in the franchise, but it's also quite short, so I'd say give it a shot if you find yourself intrigued. Castlevania Legends isn't a bad game, it just isn't a very memorable one. The biggest legacy it has is the sole appearance of a female Belmont, but Sonia's story has been made completely non-canon. Considering it involves her getting together with Alucard to create the Belmont clan, it's probably for the best. The game plays fine, building upon some of the ideas of the previous Game Boy Castlevanias, but it still feels a bit lesser. Nothing pops about it outside of a few songs. It certainly tries several different ideas, but none of them work that well. The idea of soul weapons received from bosses rather than traditional sub-weapons is an interesting one, but they never seemed as useful in the moment. There are secret rooms to find, but they often end up being enemy rushes with a poor reward. And then there's Sonia's burning mode, which makes her temporarily more powerful and invincible. While it can only be used once per life or level, saving it for the bosses often trivializes them. Legends is a flawed game, but there's certainly enjoyment to be found. But with so many great games in the series, Legends might be one of the most forgettable. In a lot of ways, I feel bad that Castlevania 64 is so low in this ranking because after playing it, I don't think it's nearly as bad as everyone makes it out to be. It has issues to be sure, but they never prevented me from actually having fun. Above all else, this feels like a classic 2D Castlevania title in 3D, something even later 3D Castlevanias never quite capture. It also has a decent amount of replay value thanks to the twin stories of Reinhard and Carrie. Their stories are different enough, but more significant are the unique levels in each path. But there are issues here that are difficult to ignore. The first level just isn't that good. It's muddy, it's confusing, and enemies never stop spawning. It paints a poor first impression of the game, especially when combined with the camera. Of course, many Nintendo 64 games don't have the best camera, but the different views available had a tendency to simply be unhelpful. There's also the odd choice of having players keep a button pressed to hold on to ledges, and some levels that are downright brutal in design. No one will forget having to carry Nitro in the castle center, where one mistake means instant death. But I'd argue that the underground waterway can be just as frustrating with its slim walkways and aggressive lizardmen. As the first attempt at a 3D Castlevania, I can appreciate it, but the more time passes, the more archaic it will feel. I think it's worth a try to see for yourself, and the final battle against Dracula can be quite epic, especially his final form. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness is an odd game. It released the exact same year as Castlevania 64, and serves as both a direct prequel and a revised take on that game. Players took the role of Cornell as he faced many of the same levels as Castlevania 64, except with slightly better graphics, controls, and camera. It is undoubtedly a better game, but it still carries many of the same overall issues of the original. Legacy of Darkness focuses on the new character of Cornell initially, who has the ability to temporarily transform himself into a werewolf, increasing his power. It's not something that needs to be used a lot, but it makes him stand out from many other Castlevania protagonists. And really, if you're deciding between which Castlevania game to play on the Nintendo 64, it should be this one. Not only does it contain Cornell's story, but a new character named Henry who has a smaller adventure where he searches for missing children. It's a more open-ended scenario with little story and only 6 levels, but Henry's gun makes for a fun power fantasy where the forces of darkness stand no chance. And once Henry's story is completed, it unlocks the story modes for both Reinhard and Carrie, both sporting slightly different looks. It's a meaty game to be sure, but whether it's worth replaying these levels again and again is up to the player. Still, I think the legacy of the Nintendo 64 games is worse than they deserve. Castlevania Judgment is not a bad idea on paper. A 3D fighting game featuring some of the most well-known characters from the series sounds amazing. Making it something akin to Power Stone really should have made it stand out. But there is something missing here. It's not a bad game at all, but it only takes a few hours to see everything that it has to offer. There are multiple modes, and multiplayer with friends could be fun, but at a certain point, I just grew bored. The fact the story mode has to be beaten twice with every character to see their proper ending just emphasizes that all the more. There are absolutely moments that can shine when using each of the characters though. Seeing Sypha's magic get unleashed, or noting how Simon and Trevor play differently despite both using the vampire killer is great. There's some entertaining dialogue between the characters, especially Golem's simplistic quotes, but there's a shallowness to it all that makes these moments fleeting. The characters are boiled down to simplistic tropes, with Maria's being the worst. Her jealousy of women with bigger chests just feels tacked on. And then there's the character designs, which are shockingly ill-fitting. Takeshi Obata of Death Note fame handled the redesigns, and many are just derivative of his own work. The costumes are so busy that it's almost a parody. I'd say the one character who was handled the best was Cornell. In all, Judgment comes across as more disappointing and kind of boring rather than outright bad. It can be fun in spurts, but after an hour, I'd expect most players will be ready to move on. It really is a pity that the TurboGrafx 16 never took off in the West. Although the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis were powerhouses at the time, there was no shortage of great games for the system. And yet, Rondo of Blood never saw release outside of Japan until the Wii Virtual Console. Instead, the rest of the world had to make do with a port on the SNES called Dracula X. Well, I say port, but it's more of a re-envisioning of the original game. Richter, Maria, and Annette might be there, and some levels are similar, but otherwise, this is a completely different beast. It's also a much harder one, needlessly so. The level design and enemy placement make some sections a chore to get through, with death only a step away. The odds are stacked against the player to such a degree that I barely felt like I was having fun. I can appreciate a hard game, but Dracula X came across as unfair rather than difficult. And much like Castlevania the Adventure, my time with Dracula X would have been significantly longer without the save states of the Wii U Virtual Console. With enough time and patience, I'm sure I could manage it, but the game simply fried my nerves and I was ready to be done with it. And I don't want to feel that way when I play Castlevania games. With a few tweaks, Dracula X could be a challenging and fun experience, even with the lack of a playable Maria and scaled-back design. The basics are there in a way reminiscent of the original Castlevania, but it goes for the gut punch every time. Bosses feel cheap, and with bottomless pits everywhere in the Dracula fight, it kills almost all sense of enjoyment for me. I'd say try it if you want a challenge, but this is a better fit for those who want the odds stacked against them. Much like Castlevania 64, Castlevania 2 gets a lot of undeserved hate in my opinion. The game itself plays fine with a lot of innovations that would be better fleshed out later in the series. Its biggest issue is that it's cryptic to the point of incoherency. The advice from villagers in the new towns often make no sense or outright lie, and figuring out the right way to go can be frustrating. Secrets are hidden in places you'd never think to look normally. Simon's Quest is simply a guide game. You're just going to need one if you plan on playing it. But with that established, the actual game is surprisingly fun. Combat feels satisfying, and there's still some challenges to be had. The day and night mechanic is original and adds a small amount of pressure to the proceedings. And leveling up Simon to become stronger is satisfying, especially as you get better equipment. The only other low point are the bosses. There are only 3 in the game: Carmilla, Death, and Dracula. Death can be ignored entirely if the player doesn't care about the golden knife, and Dracula can be locked down with little issue. At this point, Simon's Quest is a curiosity, something to play after hearing everyone talk about it, and its incredible soundtrack can't be undersold. Bloody Tears is a classic that's almost more iconic than Vampire Killer. It pumps you up and really makes the whole game memorable. I admittedly have a soft spot for Castlevania 2, but I think you might too if you tried it. Castlevania Chronicles technically serves as a remake of two games. The original version for the Japanese exclusive Sharp X68000 home computer was a remake of the first Castlevania, while Chronicles serves as a remake of that game. Both versions appear on Castlevania Chronicles, but believe me, you'll want to stick with the newest remake, as the X68000 version's difficulty can make Dracula X seem tame at times. Although Chronicles is ostensibly a remake of the first game, the castle features redesigned stages that make it feel worth replaying. Simon and Dracula were also redesigned by Symphony of the Night's character designer Ayami Kojima, which is where Red-Headed Simon came to be. I think it works for the game and gives it its own personality. That said, there are a lot of interpretations of the original Castlevania, and while this one isn't bad, it also doesn't feel like a must-play. I'd recommend it most to fans of the NES game who are looking for a different kind of challenge. The Lords of Shadow games are not exactly loved among Castlevania fans, but I always found a certain amount of enjoyment in them. Seeing the alternate takes on established lore is fun for me, and Mirror of Fate is filled with examples. Here we get not only Simon and Trevor Belmont, but a new origin for Alucard. It's moody and overwrought, but I love it anyway. The game also does a surprisingly great job of bringing the action-focused gameplay of Lords of Shadow to the 3DS, as many of the same combos and moves are replicated. It also plays like a Metroidvania, though not quite to the degree of the classics. Each playable character has their own portion of Dracula's castle to explore and abilities to obtain. They fight similarly, but the enemies and puzzles that they deal with are pretty much their own. It makes it feel more segmented than other Metroidvanias, which causes a few issues with the flow. The game isn't especially challenging, and the ending feels more like setup for Lords of Shadow 2. It's a stopgap game, here to fill in the story and keep things moving in the sequel. I enjoy Mirror of Fate for what it does and accomplishes, but nothing about it stands out that much. Not even the final boss can capture that magic. It's simply a solid entry. Kid Dracula should not be taken seriously at all, though it is seriously cool that we finally got this Famicom game as part of the Castlevania Anniversary Collection after so many years. Kid Dracula is the completely non-canon and absolutely silly take on the Castlevania franchise. Seeing chibi versions of classic monsters and the wacky level design is a lot of fun, plus the game is just a joy to play. It takes a cue from the Mega Man series with Kid Dracula able to shoot a fireball from his finger, though he can aim up and down as well. This fireball can even be charged to do more damage. With each level completed, Kid Dracula earns a new ability that helps him with many of the new trials in each stage. It's a small element that helps change up the level design while maintaining a lighthearted charm to everything. The game may not be amazing, but it's just so charming that it's difficult not to recommend it. Plus, the final boss, Galamoth, is referenced a few times throughout the Castlevania series, notably as a soul in Aria of Sorrow, and as one of the tougher bosses in Symphony of the Night. Kid Dracula is simply a good time. While Kid Dracula took its time coming to the West on the NES, the Game Boy version had no such issues. As both a sequel and retelling of the original game, this portable take on Kid Dracula is obviously not as colorful, but the gameplay has been slightly refined. There are new abilities to obtain, such as attacking with bats or using an umbrella to protect yourself from falling projectiles. Death is also by your side, adding just a bit more personality for Kid Dracula, as he has someone to interact with. It's a better experience all around, and if you can only choose one to play, I would recommend this. Chronologically, Castlevania Lament of Innocence is the first game in the series and serves as the origin story for the Belmonts, Dracula, and the Vampire Killer. It was also the second attempt to bring the games into the 3D realm. While it's undoubtedly more fun than the Nintendo 64 games, it's also a far cry from the classic Castlevania formula and not really much of a Metroidvania either. There's not a lot of platforming or puzzle solving, and each of the levels are completely separate from one another despite there being a decent amount of exploration in those levels. It feels like a game trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. But with that being said, there's something that draws me to the game. It uses a lot of classic Castlevania enemies, the combat is fluid if a little repetitive, and there was enough to see and do to keep me invested. Really, the biggest mark against it is the level design, which comes across as incredibly samey. The individual levels were unique enough, but within the level, everything ended up blending together. I never got lost thanks to the in-game map, but it made exploring just a little dull. Still, the bosses are a lot of fun with an incredibly memorable extra boss and a surprising final one. And the music is just so good, especially the Anti-Soul Mysteries Lab. As a tiptoe back to the realm of 3D, Lament of Innocence overall succeeds. It's not the most exciting on an individual level, but it serves as a solid backbone for the future 3D Castlevania games. And fortunately, they take advantage of this. I think it's well worth playing to see the origins of Dracula and the Vampire Killer. Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge on the Game Boy is a truly underrated classic. It's a game I never heard anyone talk about, which led me to believe it was another train wreck in the style of the adventure waiting to happen. But no, it significantly improves upon that game by adding 2 sub-weapons, increasing the player's movement speed, and making it so only one kind of enemy has the ability to decrease the power of the whip. That's enough to make it an immediately better game, but Belmont's Revenge goes one step further. The conceit of the game is that Dracula survived the encounter with Christopher Belmont in the adventure, but was still too weak to mount a counterattack. So instead, he lays in wait, building his power until Christopher's son comes of age. Using the power of a Belmont, Dracula reclaims his form and creates 4 new castles. And that's where this becomes unique. Not only is the story a little more involved than usual when it comes to early Castlevania, but the player can choose any of the 4 castles to explore in any order. While there's no particular advantage to the order, it does create replayability as each castle has its own type of enemies, challenges, and platforming. So when it all comes together for the 5th castle, it really feels like you're being challenged, but not in an unfair way. I was able to play and beat the game on an original cartridge, and although Dracula certainly gave me a lot of trouble, I truly had a blast discovering this hidden gem. I can't recommend it enough to fans of classic Castlevania games that might have missed it. After the success that was Symphony of the Night, it's no surprise that future Castlevanias would follow in its footsteps, eventually creating the well-known descriptor of Metroidvania. What was a surprise was the platform this idea continued on, the Game Boy Advance. Castlevania Circle of the Moon is a solid game with a pretty typical story for the series. Players take the role of Nathan Graves as he sets out to stop the resurrection of Dracula by Carmilla while also rescuing his mentor. It's the first attempt at an explorative Castlevania where the main character wields a whip at all times, meaning there's no stronger weapons to discover like with Symphony of the Night. Instead, Nathan has access to the usual lineup of sub-weapons along with special cards that enemies can drop. These cards are used in the Dual Setup System, or DSS, and can significantly change how you approach each challenge. There are action cards and attribute cards that can be combined for completely new effects. One action card might affect Nathan's whip, while the attribute cards change its element or even transform it into a different weapon entirely. They can affect his stats, his abilities, and even allow him to summon powerful avatars. It's a great system on paper with 100 different combinations, but collecting them all is the issue as they are random drops from specific enemies. You'll certainly find a fair amount on your own, but you'll have to grind quite a bit to see them all. Sadly, this is also the only truly memorable aspect of the game, as the castle design is forgettable and warp points aren't well laid out. I also find the controls to be extremely stiff, but it doesn't take long to adapt to them. Circle of the Moon is simply a solid game that's a good first effort for the handheld and worth playing if you're dying for more explorative Castlevanias. As a follow-up to Circle of the Moon, Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance does exhibit plenty of improvements. The controls are tighter and the castle is more dynamic and memorable. Oddly, the stories of the two are pretty similar, except this time it's Juiced Belmont traveling to the castle to rescue his childhood friend while working together with an old ally. I think it works a little better here with its connections to Simon's Quest, but the game does feel safer than its predecessor as well. It's not as difficult, and there are fewer hidden areas to discover. Even the element that makes the game unique, the spellbooks, don't feel as dynamic as what Circle of the Moon presented. Instead, each book is used in conjunction with one of Juiced's sub-weapons to create a powerful new attack. They're certainly more impressive to look at, and it's nice that they can be found in the castle rather than needing to grind certain enemies for a drop. I understand all these issues, but there's something that draws me to Harmony of Dissonance. I like the aesthetic, I greatly prefer the controls, and I think the game looks good on the system. There might be some nostalgia influence here, as this was the first Castlevania I played after Symphony of the Night, but I do believe that this is a good entry point for complete newcomers to get into the series. Castlevania Harmony of Despair is a love letter to the franchise in a style that I honestly wish more developers would emulate. In some ways, it's not all that impressive. It takes assets mainly from the most recent games in the series, which includes characters, enemies, and locations, and mixes them together to create a series of levels that up to 6 players can take on at a time. Each character has their own stats, best equipment, and abilities that make them stand out, but in order to get those, you're going to need to grind. Everything that drops is random, and the best stuff can only be obtained at the harder difficulty. Put all this together, and it seems lazy and downright cheap. But that's the crazy thing. It works. Playing these characters, fighting your favorite, and slowly building them up into complete beasts that destroy what gave you trouble before is immensely satisfying. On your own, it's easy to turn off your brain and play through it, especially as the new remixes are some of the best in the series. But if you can get friends together online, this can be some of the most fun you have in a Castlevania. It was a joy to play in a group and either decimate everything in our way, or just barely miss the win. Sure, the entire gameplay loop is about that grind, but for longtime Castlevania fans, it's just a lot of fun. Of course, if you're not into that grind, then stay far away, but if you can get a group together, then I say go for it, as the servers are still live as of this moment. I'll be frank, Castlevania Lords of Shadow just has a dull opening. While you're thrust into the combat right away, the tutorial battle feels like every other God of War clone. Then the next level is a one-off horse chase that does little to excite, followed by a decidedly decent look at the exploration and minor platforming. Then a Titan shows up and it becomes a Shadow of the Colossus knockoff. There's just no identity here, and I believe that's why so many Castlevania fans were turned away. But there's a moment when the rebooted story starts clicking into place and a fun gameplay mechanic is introduced: light and shadow magic. Hitting enemies with light magic is what Gabriel Belmont uses to heal, while shadow magic increases his attack power. It's simple, but the combat truly opens up from there and became something I really enjoyed. Despite progression being level-based, there are secrets to find and return to, adding a little something more than just combat. Like Mirror of Fate, it's overwrought in its narration, but the aesthetic works for me, especially once the castle is introduced. Lords of Shadow works best when it does its own thing and doesn't try to crib ideas from other action games. When it clicks, I can have an absolute blast, and its new timeline is filled with winks and nods to the old games while doing something new. Sure, the final boss comes out of nowhere, but Patrick Stewart is always a joy to listen to. Where it stumbles again is its DLC, where the plot is a bit thin in how it justifies the introduction of Dracula. Reverie is more puzzle-based, and I had fun with it, but Resurrection cranks up the difficulty to be more trial and error, which didn't really do it for me. Given a chance, I think Lords of Shadow could surprise and even impress you. I've seen Castlevania 3 described as the best of the NES trilogy, and to a degree, I completely get it. It's bigger and absolutely more replayable than the previous two, with multiple paths to take and different characters to play as. It also sets up a lot of what comes later, as this is the first confrontation between the Belmonts and Dracula, while also introducing Alucard. The game is a big deal and can be a lot of fun. It's just a shame that the North American version is an exercise in absolute frustration. Dracula's Curse isn't like that all the time, as the opening levels are a lot of fun and show what the game could really be like. But when that second half happens, it feels so punishing. The enemies hit hard, they're everywhere, and checkpoints don't happen that often. In fact, unlike every other Castlevania game, it puts players at the start of the level when a game over happens during the Dracula fight, rather than right before that final encounter. It requires a level of perfection and perseverance that emblemizes Nintendo hard, and I needed save states to even think about beating it. It's not just frustrating for this reason though. It's aggravating because the Japanese version is so much more forgiving. North America changed it so that kids would have to rent the game more often to actually beat it. It cheapens the impact of a game that should be celebrated because I absolutely recognize how good it is. But if you're going to play the Japanese version that's part of the Castlevania Anniversary Collection. Not only will you get a better game, but a phenomenal soundtrack as well. I love it, but I hate that it hurts me. As a remake of Castlevania Rondo of Blood, the Dracula X Chronicles does a great job of capturing what made the original so good. It's the first time the game was playable in English, and it was designed to have slightly more of a connection to its direct sequel, Symphony of the Night. The 3D visuals look good, though they lack the expressiveness and timeless quality of the original sprites. It's not unappealing, it's just not as good. The game plays well too, with all the same secrets and goodies to find, with a few extras thrown in, such as a new boss fight and a new phase of the Dracula battle. That said, none of it really improves upon the original. It feels more like a slight remix than anything else. Really, it's the value of the entire package that's notable, as along with this remake, it includes the original Rondo of Blood with an English translation and a redubbed version of Symphony of the Night. Both of these are now available on the PS4 as Castlevania Requiem, though without the 3D remake. On its own, Dracula X Chronicles is fun, but I'd recommend the original more. Castlevania The Hdventure Rebirth feels like a tragedy. Here is a rare remake of a bad game to make it something good, and yet it was only ever released on WiWare. And since WiWare is now dead, there's no way for anyone to play it unless they've already bought it. Now, I call this a remake, but it's almost a reimagining, as only the bare essentials of the original game can be found in Rebirth. None of the levels are the same, Christopher Belmont has access to sub-weapons, and new bosses and sub-bosses have been added. And it's all the better for it. The only things that really carry over is the basic plot, the enemies, and the ability to upgrade the whip so that it can shoot fireballs. However, rather than losing upgrades every time you're hit, the fireballs are now a limited time upgrade. It's a much better system, and with the more controlled jump, Hdventure Rebirth is a significantly more pleasant time. There is an option to bring back the classic jump style and losing your whip upgrade with each hit if you so desire, but this is just a better game all around and holds up on its own merits. If it was actually available, I think it would be the perfect way to get into classic Castlevania games. For a long time, the only way to play Castlevania Bloodlines was to have an original cartridge on the Sega Genesis. That's how I had to play it for the streams. It was simply never re-released despite being a great Castlevania game. Thankfully, that has now been fixed thanks to the Castlevania Anniversary Collection and the Genesis Mini. Now more people than ever can discover this classic that does a lot of things different from the usual Castlevania fare. Rather than explore a castle, levels take place across Europe, allowing for much more varied landscapes. Each one feels different, and the ramp up in difficulty is never that bad. In addition, there are two playable characters, John Morris and Eric Lecard. John is more of a typical Castlevania protagonist as he wields a whip, but he also provides a more tangible connection to Bram Stoker's Dracula, which has been a part of the series since the original NES game. Eric uses a spear, allowing him much greater reach and a seriously impressive jump. Both are great fun to use, and the game itself is just good. There's nothing too drastically different beyond that. It's a lost classic that more people can now enjoy, and an easy recommendation. We've made it through 22 games so far, and really, I think only a couple of them aren't worth playing at all. What do you think of the list so far? Do you agree with the order? Let us know in the comments, and make sure to come back next time as I rank my top 10 Castlevania games. Which will be number 1? You'll have to come back and find out. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to Game Explained for any future Castlevania news and other things gaming.